Ich bleib Berlin, meiner alten Liebe treu.
Vintage Berlin stuff. It's as if a clash of ideas is the lifeblood of the city. A tense equilibrium of opposing poles that keeps the balance. For it is a place that knows and understands what happens if the balance is tipped. On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor. Red Berlin was defeated. Goebbels' Nazi propaganda, promises of new jobs and food, they'd all turned the tide in the city. It was as if Berlin had finally chosen its dancing partner. It was the end of an era. The Institute for Sexual Research was attacked, while a Hitler Youth band played outside. The entire library was paraded behind a bust of Magnus Hirschfeld to the Opernplatz. And here it was burned, with other literature deemed degenerate. The organizer of the bonfire, Joseph Goebbels, proclaimed, with his usual hyperbole, the coming of a new age.
Eine Handlung, die vor aller Welt dokumentieren soll. Hier sinkt die geistige Grundlage der Novemberrepublik zu Boden. Aber aus diesen Trümmern wird sich siegreich erheben der Phönix eines neuen Geistes.
The battle of ideas that was waged in Berlin would eventually lead to the terrible costs of the Second World War. The 6-year global conflict also came to its conclusion in this very city. Of all Berlin's haunted streets, none is more strangely evocative than Vossstraße. One pre-war house remains standing, still pockmarked with bullet scars from the battle over 64 years ago. It was here, beneath the Reichschancellery, that Hitler and his closest lieutenants, including Joseph Goebbels, had remained in a bunker till the very end. The forlorn cavern is now buried beneath a Chinese restaurant and a kindergarten. When the conquering Russian troops uncovered the bunker amongst the ruins, they found the charred remains of Goebbels and his wife. They'd taken their own lives after forcing cyanide capsules into the mouths of their sleeping children. Inside the ruined bunker, on the wall of Hitler's study, the troops found an empty picture frame. The painting which the frame held was one of Hitler's most prized possessions. It had traveled with him wherever he went. And like the Führer himself, it depicted a man who was both a tyrant and a dreamer. Someone familiar. It was old Fritz, Frederick the Great. It was Frederick the Great, who was King of Prussia more than 200 years earlier, had ruthlessly expanded his empire through military might, while at the same time indulging his love of poetry, music, and the philosophical ideas behind the Enlightenment. Before he committed suicide, Hitler had entrusted the painting to his personal pilot to try and spirit it out of Berlin. But the story doesn't end here. The association with Hitler might have tainted the reputation of the enlightened despot, but Frederick's spirit and his ideas were to endure. They would forever be bound to the city as Berlin became divided and entered a new phase of its troubled existence. Emergent communist East Germany and its capital, East Berlin, wanted little to do with the monarch who was seen as an inspiration to Hitler. In 1950, his statue was removed from Unter den Linden, where it had proudly stood for almost a century. And his palaces themselves fell within the newly drawn-up borders of East Germany. Like the monarch, they entered a period of neglect and near ruin. The assistant custodian at Sans Souci lived through a time when everything wasn't quite so well cared for.
Und was war Ihr Eindruck von Friedrich dem Großen, als Sie in der DDR aufgewachsen sind?
Der war also zweigeteilt. Einmal kannte ich die Schlösser, die schönen, die er hat bauen lassen. Und andererseits habe ich im Geschichtsunterricht einen ganz anderen Friedrich den Großen damals kennengelernt.
War
Gar nicht
der,
so einfach,
dieser andere,
miteinander
zu verbinden.
Ja.
Und der andere Friedrich der Große, wie war der? Was für ein Charakter, was für ein Typ war der?
Der Offizielle. Ja, das war ein absolutistischer König, der sozusagen die Bevölkerung ja ausgebeutet hat, wie das in der Zeit war. Und deswegen haben wir eben auch gelernt, nicht Friedrich der Große zu sagen, sondern Friedrich der Zweite.
Und was glauben Sie jetzt über Friedrich II. Oder Friedrich den Großen?
Na, dass er eine widersprüchliche Person ist.
Das ist er auf jeden Fall, ja. Perhaps for the very first time in its history, the clash of ideas here in Berlin was now clearly defined on the map. The city had become a microcosm of the post-war world, divided between a communist East and a capitalist West. And for those who now returned from exile during the war, they had to decide, literally, whose side they were on.
And in 1961, the Berlin Wall was built. The plan to stem the hemorrhage of refugees heading west. This is West Berlin, according to an East German map of the 1980s. For the East Germans, the western sector had ceased to exist, a blank island in the sea of communism.
Which was the true Berlin? Which was the true Germany? In response to what they saw as the relentless Americanization of the West, the communist government in East Berlin resurrected a feudal icon of Prussia's past. One dull December day in 1980, who should find himself back on his perch here on Unter den Linden? None other than Frederick the Great.
Communist East Berlin was embracing a feudal monarch. Anything to give it historical legitimacy. Whatever they had previously said or felt about Hitler's favorite Prussian monarch, the regime now saw him as a great example of tolerance, of compassion, and of enlightened thought. And even though the regime would not admit it, the Prussian military ethic that Frederick also stood for provided a sound model for its own increasingly militarized nation, where soldiers goose-stepped down Unter den Linden in the way the Nazis and the Prussians had done before them. After all, East Berlin was the part of the city that contained all the architecture of the Prussian kings. Surely the communists now thought they should embrace this enigmatic monarch and become the capital of the true Germany. Just like the street that bore his name, Friedrichstraße, he was divided, fought over, irreconcilable. And on the 9th of November 1989, the words of the king could have so easily been quoted back at the beleaguered East German state.
Justice must be the main responsibility of a sovereign. Since it is the prime interest of the many people whom they control. They must give it priority over any other interest of their own.
Frederick had always wished for a simple burial on the hill at Sans Souci, next to his beloved dogs. But even though he had died in 1786, this wish wouldn't be granted for another 2 centuries. In 1991, after Berlin had become capital of a reunited Germany, Frederick finally came home. But what they wanted to lay to rest here was more than just a body.
Love him and loathe him, even from his self-effacing grave, Frederick the Great and his split personality still haunt German history and the history of Berlin. Now, he never got a chance to reconcile the two sides of his character, but I think we Germans did, eventually.
It was the end of an era. The Institute for Sexual Research was attacked, while a Hitler Youth band played outside. The entire library was paraded behind a bust of Magnus Hirschfeld to the Opernplatz. And here, on the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor. Red Berlin was defeated. Goebbels' Nazi propaganda, promises of new jobs and food, they'd all turned the tide in the city. It was as if Berlin had finally chosen its dancing partner.
Ich bleib Berlin, meiner alten Liebe treu.
Vintage Berlin stuff.
It's as if a clash of ideas is the lifeblood of the city. A tense equilibrium of opposing poles that keeps the balance. For it is a place that knows and understands what happens if the balance is
Die Grundlage der Novemberrepublik zu Boden. Aber aus diesen Trümmern wird sich siegreich erheben der Phönix eines neuen Geistes.
The battle of ideas that was waged in Berlin would eventually lead to the terrible costs of the... It was burnt, with other literature deemed degenerate. The organizer of the bonfire, Joseph Goebbels, proclaimed, with his usual hyperbole, the coming of a new age.
Eine Handlung, die vor aller Welt dokumentieren soll. Hier singt die geistige